In the sun-baked solitude of Prairie Junction, where the railroad cuts through miles of golden wheat fields, fate was about to orchestrate an unexpected reunion of two broken hearts. Mason Thorne, a weathered cattle rancher nursing the quiet grief of widowhood, never imagined finding love again at the dusty train platform where he collected his monthly supplies. But there she stood, Sarah Mitchell, abandoned in her faded wedding dress, deemed too old at 38 by a groom's family who never met her. As the merciless prairie sun beat down, he recognized in her eyes the same dignified sorrow he carried in his own soul. Sometimes life's deepest wounds lead us to our greatest healings, and love's sweetest stories begin where others end. Could two hearts, scarred by life's cruel disappointments, find the courage to believe in love? One. Last time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mason's boots left dusty imprints on the wooden porch as he entered the ranch house, the screen door creaking its familiar welcome. The setting sun painted long shadows across the kitchen, where Catherine's presence still lingered in every corner. His calloused fingers traced the edge of the old pine table, her table, where she'd served countless meals to hungry ranch hands and welcomed every stray soul who crossed their threshold. In the fading light, his eyes settled on the weathered recipe box perched on the highest kitchen shelf. It had been 2 years since he'd last opened it, since the day they laid Catherine to rest beneath the old oak tree overlooking their favorite pasture. The box held more than just recipes. It contained 15 years of their shared life, written in her flowing script on cards stained with vanilla extract and butter fingerprints. "Mr. Thorne?" Tom, his youngest ranch hand, called from outside. "The new calves need checking." "Be right there," Mason replied, his voice rough from disuse. These days, he spoke more to his cattle than to people. The recipe box seemed to watch him from its perch, like a sentinel guarding memories he wasn't ready to disturb. Catherine had been 39 when cancer took her, the same age he was now. Some mornings, he still reached across the empty bed, expecting to find her there. He stepped out onto the porch, where the evening air carried the sweet scent of prairie grass. Tom, barely 20 and eager to prove himself, waited by the corral. The boy reminded Mason of himself at that age, full of dreams about ranching and building a legacy. "The mama cow's having trouble," Tom explained, falling into step beside him. "Reminds me of that night last spring when Miss Catherine talked me through my first calving. Remember how she made us all hot chocolate afterward?" Mason nodded, throat tight. Catherine had always known exactly what everyone needed. A cup of cocoa, a kind word, a gentle push in the right direction. Her absence felt especially sharp during these moments when her wisdom would have made all the difference. The barn's interior was warm with animal heat and the sweet smell of hay. In the corner stall, a black heifer lowed softly, her sides heaving with effort. Mason rolled up his sleeves, muscle memory taking over as he assessed the situation. His hands knew what to do, even if his heart felt hollow performing these tasks without Catherine's steady presence beside him. Later that night, with a new calf wobbling beside its mother, Mason sat at the kitchen table. The recipe box seemed to call to him. With hands that trembled slightly, he finally reached for it, bringing it down from its perch. Inside, beneath recipes for buttermilk biscuits and apple pie, he found Catherine's letters, ones she'd written during her last months, tucked away like precious secrets. "My dearest Mason," the first one began, "when you find these, I hope, enough time has passed that the memories bring more smiles than tears." His vision blurred as he read her final gift to him, permission to love again. "Life is too precious to spend it alone," she'd written. "Your heart is too big to keep it locked away. When the right moment comes, and it will come, remember that loving again doesn't mean loving me any less." The screen door's creak startled him. Hannah, his sister, stood in the doorway with a covered dish. She'd been bringing him dinner every Sunday since Catherine passed, though they both knew he could cook just fine. "You're looking at her recipes," Hannah observed softly, setting the dish on the counter. "Found something else too," Mason replied, carefully folding the letter. "She always did think of everything." Hannah pulled out a chair, the wood scraping against the floor. "She would want you to be happy, Mason. 2 years is a long time to be alone." The words echoed Catherine's letter, so closely that Mason felt a shiver run down his spine. Outside, a warm breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees Catherine had planted along the drive, their leaves whispering like distant conversations. Sarah Mitchell sat rigid on the hard wooden bench at Prairie Junction, her fingers absently turning the gold band that now felt like a mockery. The morning sun glinted off the modest diamond, a ring chosen with such care by a man she'd never actually met. 6 months of letters, of shared dreams and gentle promises had led to this moment. Or rather, should have led to a different moment. Entirely. The telegram lay crumpled in her reticule. Family objects, marriage impossible, ring returned with regrets. 15 words to end what she'd thought would be her last chance at happiness. The station master had delivered it with awkward sympathy, then retreated to his office, leaving her alone with her humiliation. At 38, she'd known the risks of a mail-order arrangement, teaching in the same small Kansas town for 16. Years had left her with few prospects, watching as her students grew up, married, and began having children of their own. She'd been Miss Mitchell for so long that some days she forgot she had a Christian name at all. Her hands smoothed the wrinkles of her wedding dress, cream-colored cotton, practical yet pretty, sewn over long winter evenings. She'd chosen the fabric carefully, wanting something that would transition into a proper house dress after the ceremony. No point in waste, her mother had always said. Now it felt like she'd wasted more than just fabric. "Would you like some water?" "Miss." The station master's wife appeared, holding out a tin cup. Her kind eyes held no pity, just understanding. "I've got fresh biscuits too, if you're hungry." Sarah accepted the water but shook her head at the offer of food. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. You're very kind." Her voice remained steady, years of classroom discipline serving her well. She'd never let her students see her cry, and she wouldn't. "Break now. Trains run both ways," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "No shame in going back home." But there was shame in returning to the whispers and sidelong glances, in facing her sister's well-meaning but insufferable pity. Emily, younger by 10 years and already blessed with 3 children, had warned her against this venture. "At our age," she'd said, though she was hardly old enough to use "our," "we must be practical about expectations." Sarah's fingers closed around the ring in her pocket. The smooth metal had warmed to her touch, no longer the icy weight it had been when she first pulled it from the telegram envelope. James Cooper had seemed so different from the local men who dismissed her as too educated, too independent, too set in her ways. His letters spoke of books they both loved, of his dream to build a proper library in his growing Montana town, of wanting a wife who could be a true partner. What his letters hadn't mentioned was his mother's determination to secure a younger bride for her only son, one with better prospects for providing grandchildren. Sarah had learned this from the station master, who'd overheard the family's heated discussion at the telegraph office earlier that morning. "Better to know now," he'd said gruffly before shuffling away to attend to his duties. Perhaps he was right, but knowledge was cold comfort on a day when all her hopes lay shattered on a station platform hundreds of miles from home. A distant whistle pierced the morning air, another train approaching. Sarah straightened her spine, years of posture, lessons becoming armor. She had money enough for a return ticket, and her position at the school probably remained open. Miss Wilson, who'd agreed to substitute, had been planning to marry in June anyway. The train grew larger, its approach stirring the hot air and lifting loose strands of hair from Sarah's carefully pinned chignon. She watched it with weary resignation, noting how the sun transformed the steam into a golden halo. There was beauty even in retreat, she supposed, though the thought brought little comfort. The ring in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. It represented more than just a broken engagement. It was every no she'd received. In life, every door closed because she was too much of this or not enough of that. Part of her wanted to fling it onto the tracks, let it be crushed beneath the approaching train's wheels. Instead, she gripped it tighter. Some battles weren't worth fighting, her father used to say, but that didn't mean you had to surrender your dignity. The screen door of the station office banged shut as Mason emerged with his monthly supply list. The sound made Sarah start, her hands instinctively clutching her reticule closer. She watched as he paused on the weathered boards of the platform, his eyes squinting against the harsh morning light. There was something in his bearing that spoke of careful dignity, the kind earned through years of facing whatever the day might bring. Mason noticed her tears before she realized she was crying. The sunlight had caught them, turning them into tiny prisms on her cheeks. Without thought, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, plain white cotton, pressed and folded, the way Catherine had taught him. A man should always carry two, she'd insisted, one for himself and one for someone in need. "Ma'am," he said, extending the carefully folded square. His voice was rough from disuse but gentle, like someone approaching a startled deer. Sarah hesitated before accepting the offering. The handkerchief was clean but well-worn, the kind of practical item that spoke of a man's character. A small CT was embroidered in one corner in faded blue thread. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne? Mason Thorne." He shifted his weight, boots creaking on the platform boards. "My ranch is about 10 miles east." She dabbed at her eyes, careful not to smudge what remained of her composure. "Sarah Mitchell, I should apologize for being such a spectacle." "No need for apologies out here, Miss Mitchell. Prairie's seen worse than a few honest tears." The simple truth in his words loosened something in her chest. "Mrs. Henderson offered me biscuits," she said, not knowing why she shared this detail. "I couldn't accept. Somehow that seemed like admitting defeat." Mason nodded, understanding, written in the lines around his eyes. Sometimes the kindness of strangers is the hardest thing to bear. The station master emerged from his office, pointedly busying himself with the arrival board, though no trains were due for hours. His wife appeared in the doorway behind him, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I should return your handkerchief," Sarah began, but Mason raised a weathered hand. "Keep it. Seems like you might have more need of it than I do today." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "The initials, they're not yours." "No, ma'am. They belong to my wife, Catherine." He paused, the word belonged hanging heavy in the air. "She passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and meant it. There was something in the way he spoke of his wife that made her own. Situation seemed smaller, less devastating. "Life has its own ideas about our plans sometimes," Mason said, looking out across the prairie where heat waves danced above the tall grass. "Catherine used to say that God closes doors, so we'll notice the windows." Sarah's fingers traced the embroidered initials. "And have you found any windows, Mr. Thorne?" The question surprised them both. It wasn't the kind of thing she normally asked strangers, nor the kind of thing he normally answered. But there was something about the moment, perhaps the shared understanding of loss, or simply the vastness of the prairie around them, that made honesty feel natural. "Some days I remember to look," he replied. "Others I'm still staring at." The door. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the station office with a fresh pot of coffee and 3 cups on a tray. She set them on the bench beside Sarah without comment and retreated, her footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. Mason poured 2 cups, offering one to Sarah. The coffee was strong and hot, its familiar bitterness an anchor in a world that had stopped making sense hours ago. "Thank you," she said, and they both knew she meant more than just the coffee. They sat in comfortable silence, watching heat mirages dance across the distant prairie. The coffee cooled in their cups, and somewhere a meadowlark called to its mate. Sarah's fingers still held the handkerchief, its soft cotton bearing witness to this strange moment of connection between two people who had expected to spend the day alone with their respective sorrows. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent. When the station master emerged again, a yellow telegram form clutched in his hand. He hesitated, glancing between Mason and Sarah before approaching. "Miss Mitchell," another message came through. He held out the paper with an apologetic expression. "From your sister Emily." Sarah accepted the telegram, her fingers trembling slightly. Mason found himself holding his breath as she unfolded it, noting how the paper crackled in the dry prairie air. "She wants me to come home immediately," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion Mason could see in her eyes. "She's already arranged for my old position at the school to be held." The station master cleared his throat. "Next eastbound train comes through at sunset, about 3 hours from now." He paused, then added, "No charge for the ticket change, miss. Least we can do." Mason watched as Sarah carefully refolded the telegram, tucking it away with the first one. Her movements were precise, controlled, the gestures of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining dignity in difficult moments. He thought of Catherine's letter in his pocket, of her words about love and second chances. "Miss Mitchell," he heard himself say, "might I make an alternative suggestion?" Sarah looked up, surprise flickering across her features. The station master paused in his retreat, turning back with poorly concealed interest. "I own a good-sized ranch," Mason continued, his heart hammering against his ribs. 600 acres, debt-free, good water rights, strong herd. But it needs," he swallowed hard, "it needs what I can't give it alone. A proper home. A future." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes, along with something that might have been hope or fear. "Mr. Thorne, I'm not offering out of pity," he said quickly, needing her to understand, "and I'm not looking to replace what I've lost, but I recognize something in you, something steady and true, something worth building a life around." The station master had given up any pretense of leaving, standing rooted to the platform as if carved from the same wood as the support beams. Through the office window, Mrs. Henderson's face appeared and disappeared like a prairie moon behind clouds. "We're strangers," Sarah said softly, though Mason noticed she hadn't said no. "We're both people who understand loss," he replied, "and hope, and the courage it takes to try again." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing Catherine's letter. "My late wife wrote me something before she passed, about how love isn't meant to be locked away. I didn't understand until today, sitting here, watching how you faced your disappointment. With such grace." Sarah's fingers found Catherine's handkerchief, still folded neatly in her lap. "You're suggesting marriage? Today?" "Judge Wilson stays late at his office on Thursdays," the station master interjected, then reddened as both Mason and Sarah turned to look at him. Just mentioning it. Mason felt a smile tugging at his lips, his first genuine smile in longer than he could remember. "What do you say, Miss Mitchell? Shall we disappoint your sister and surprise my ranch hands in one fell swoop?" For a long moment, Sarah was silent. Mason could almost see the thoughts racing behind her eyes, all the practical concerns, the risks, the potential for more heartbreak. But there was something else too, a spark of adventure that reminded him of Catherine's letter. Life is too precious to spend it alone. "You should know," Sarah said finally. "I'm considered rather strong-minded for a woman my age. I have opinions about books and education. I'm not very good at being decorative." Mason's smile widened. "My cattle don't care much for decoration, Miss Mitchell, but they've been known to appreciate a strong mind now and then." The station master's wife burst from the office, unable to contain herself any longer. "I've got a cake," she announced. "Not a proper wedding cake, mind you, but I baked it fresh this morning, and I can press your dress, miss, if you'd like." Sarah looked down at her cream-colored cotton dress, then back at Mason. A slow smile spread across her face, transforming it in a way that made Mason's heart skip. "Well, Mr. Thorne, it seems the window you mentioned has just blown wide open." The ranch house emerged from the twilight, like a painting slowly coming into focus, a two-story structure of weathered wood and quiet dignity, with a wrap-around porch that spoke of summer evenings and peaceful contemplation. Mason's wagon wheels crunched on the gravel drive as they approached, the sound drawing several ranch hands from the nearby bunkhouse. In her lap, Sarah held the iron key Mason had given her after the hasty ceremony. Judge Wilson had raised an eyebrow at their request, but had conducted the proceedings with proper solemnity, seeming to recognize something genuine in their unconventional arrangement. Now, as the wagon rolled to a stop, the key's weight felt both promising and terrifying. "That's Tom by the corral," Mason said softly, nodding toward a young man whose expression wavered between curiosity and confusion. "And that's Burke and Henderson by the bunkhouse. Good men, all of them." Sarah nodded, noting how the ranch hands tried to mask their surprise at seeing a woman in a wedding dress seated beside their boss. Their attempts at casualness might have been comical under different circumstances. "Mr. Thorne," Tom called out, stepping forward. "We weren't expecting—" His voice trailed off as he searched for appropriate words. "Mrs. Thorne and I were married this afternoon," Mason said, the new name falling from his lips with careful reverence. He climbed down from the wagon and moved to help Sarah descend. "She'll be making her home with us now." The key pressed against Sarah's palm as she accepted Mason's assistance. Her cream-colored dress, somewhat wrinkled from the journey, caught the last rays of sunlight. She heard a sharp intake of breath from the bunkhouse direction and realized these men had known Catherine, had mourned her alongside Mason. Her arrival must seem like a ghost stepping into reality. "Welcome home, Mom," Tom said finally, removing his hat. The others followed suit, a gesture of respect that brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. Mason's hand found the small of her back, steady and reassuring, as he guided her toward the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked a familiar welcome beneath their feet. At the door, he stepped back slightly, making space for her to use the key. Sarah's hands trembled as she fitted the iron key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a solid click that seemed to echo across the prairie itself. The door swung open, revealing a home that held both welcome and challenge in its shadows. The kitchen came first, clean but bearing the unmistakable signs of a house maintained by a man alone. The curtains hung slightly crooked, and dishes were stacked in practical but joyless efficiency. A recipe box perched on a high shelf caught her eye, and she remembered Mason's earlier mention of Catherine's culinary legacy. "I know it's not what you expected," Mason said quietly, watching her take in her new domain. "When you packed for a different life this morning." Sarah turned to face him, still holding the key. In the fading light, his features held a vulnerability that touched her deeply. "Life rarely gives us what we expect, Mr. Thorne. Sometimes it gives us something we didn't even know to hope for." A shuffling sound drew their attention to the doorway, where Tom stood, awkwardly holding Sarah's carpet bag. "Burke's bringing—" "The trunk, Mom," he said. "We'll just set everything in the parlor unless you'd prefer otherwise." "The parlor will be fine, thank you," Sarah replied, her teacher's voice carrying natural authority. Tom nodded and retreated, leaving them alone in the kitchen's growing shadows. Mason moved to light the lamp on the table, its warm glow creating a circle of intimacy in the gathering dusk. "There's bread and preserves," he offered. "I'm not much of a cook, but—" "Then we'll learn together," Sarah said, surprising herself. With the certainty in her voice, she placed the key deliberately on the table, no longer just a piece of iron, but a symbol of the choice they'd both made. "Though I should warn you, my cooking has been known to surprise people." A genuine smile crossed Mason's face. "I look forward to being surprised, Mrs. Thorne." The new name hung in the air between them, not quite comfortable yet, but full of possibility. Outside, the ranch hands' voices drifted through the evening air, discussing the day's miracle in hushed, wondering tones. Inside, a man and woman who had begun the day as strangers stood in their shared kitchen. watching lamplight dance across walls that held one life's memories and another life's promises. Dawn found Sarah standing at the kitchen window, coffee cup warming her hands as she surveyed the overgrown rectangle that had once been Catherine's garden. Morning glory vines had claimed the fence posts, their purple flowers just beginning to open in the early light. Beneath them, perennials fought for space with determined weeds, creating a wild tangle that spoke of both neglect and resilience. She loved that garden. Mason's voice came from behind her, startling Sarah from her contemplation. Used to say it was her piece of paradise in the prairie. Sarah turned to find him already dressed for the day's work, his coffee cup matching. Hers, one of the small domestic rhythms they'd discovered in their first week together. It's still beautiful in its own way, she offered. Wild, but beautiful. Mason moved to stand beside her at the window. I couldn't bring myself to touch it after, well, felt wrong somehow, changing what she'd planted. The garden seemed to hold their silence, morning light catching on dew-heavy spiderwebs strung between the ruins of what must have been neat rows. Sarah thought of Catherine's recipe box, now sharing space with her own modest collection of cookery notes. Some legacies she was learning were meant to be built upon rather than preserved unchanged. What if, she said carefully, we didn't change it so much as restore it, give it room to be what it was meant to be again? Mason's reflection in the window showed a complex mix of emotions. You wouldn't mind working in her garden? I think, Sarah replied, choosing her words with care, that gardens are meant to grow. Like people, like, she hesitated, then finished softly, like love. The morning silence held a different quality now, thoughtful rather than heavy. Outside, a meadowlark began its morning song, and the sounds of the ranch hands beginning their day drifted in from the direction of the stables. I've got some of her old garden journals, Mason said finally, in the study. Never could bring myself to move them. Sarah set her coffee cup down with quiet determination. Then perhaps that's where we should start, though I should warn you, my experience with gardens is mostly theoretical. The schoolhouse had a small vegetable patch, but a genuine smile touched Mason's lips. Catherine killed 3 rose bushes before she got the hang of it, said the prairie had to teach her its own ways of growing things. Their laughter, shared in the morning light, felt like another small victory. These moments had been coming more frequently, brief connections over shared meals, quiet conversations as they settled into their new routine. Last night, she'd found him reading one of the books she'd brought from her teaching days, and they'd talked about literature until the lamp oil ran low. Tom mentioned the general store's getting seed catalogues in next week, Mason said, his voice holding a note of careful hope. If you'd like to look through them. For the garden, Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Not the desperate hope she'd carried to Prairie Junction as a mail-order bride, but something steadier, more grounded. I'd like that very much. The sound of pots clattering in the bunkhouse reminded them of the day ahead. The men will be wanting breakfast soon, Sarah said, moving toward the stove with growing confidence. She'd learned quickly that ranch hands were far more appreciative of hearty food than perfect presentation. Sarah, Mason said, using her given name with careful deliberation. They were still finding their way with names, with the intimacy of marriage formed in haste but growing in measured steps. Thank you for seeing possibility where I saw only the past. She turned back to him, struck by how the morning light softened his features. The past doesn't leave us, she said softly. It just makes room for what comes next. As if in answer, a morning breeze stirred the garden's wild growth, creating waves of movement in the tangled green. Through the window, Sarah could almost imagine the garden it would become. Not Catherine's garden exactly, but something new, something that honored what was while embracing what could be. Like their marriage, it would require patience, care, and the courage to let beauty find its own way of blooming. The first Sunday after their marriage dawned clear and cool. Sarah stood before the modest washstand, pinning her hair with careful precision, when she heard Mason in the hallway. He carried something wrapped in faded velvet, his steps deliberate, as he made his way to their shared bedroom. "I thought," he said, hesitating in the doorway, "you might want to add your family's names." He unwrapped the package, revealing a leather-bound Bible, its pages gilt-edged but worn with years of handling. "It's tradition in the Thorne family, recording our histories together." Sarah's hands stilled on her last hairpin. Through the mirror, she watched as Mason placed the Bible on the small table between their sides of the bed. Its presence there felt significant, a bridge between past and present. "My father was a preacher," she said quietly, turning to face him. "Did I mention that? He kept our family Bible just like this one. Emily has it now." Mason opened the cover carefully, revealing pages of flowing script spanning generations. "Catherine added her family's line here," he said, finger tracing a column of names. "She said a marriage isn't just two people, but two histories coming together." Sarah moved to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as they looked down at the recorded lives. Birth dates, marriage dates, death dates, all carefully preserved in different hands. She found Catherine's name, written in Mason's strong script, with a death date that made her heart ache for his loss. "Look here," Mason said softly, turning to a blank space beside their hastily recorded marriage date. "Room for your family, too. Your parents, grandparents, all of them. They're part of our story now." Sarah traced the empty space with gentle fingers. "Papa would have liked that. He always said family trees need new branches to stay strong." She paused, then added, "Though I doubt he imagined his daughter's branch growing quite this way." A comfortable silence fell between them as Mason pulled out the chair for her at the small writing desk. She sat, accepting the pen he offered, and began to write. Her father's name came first, Reverend James Mitchell, born in Ohio, laid to rest in Kansas soil. Then her mother, her grandparents, the aunt who taught her to love books. "Margaret Rose Mitchell," she said as she wrote. Her mother's name. She made the best apple pies in 3 counties. Used to say cooking was just love made visible. Mason smiled. Catherine would have liked her. She believed the same about her garden. The mention of Catherine no longer brought the awkward tension of their first days. Instead, it felt natural, a ghost transformed into a gentle presence, like pressed flowers between Bible pages. "Tell me about your parents," Sarah said, making room for the Thorne family history beside her own. As Mason spoke of his father's determination to build the ranch from nothing, of his mother's quiet strength, Sarah's pen moved steadily across the page, weaving their histories together in permanent ink. A knock at the door interrupted their task. "Mr. Thorne?" Tom's voice carried through the wood. "Burke's wife's asking if Mrs. Thorne's still planning to help with the Sunday school lesson." Sarah glanced at the clock, surprised by how the morning had slipped away. "I'll be right there," she called, adding the final name to their growing family tree. Mason helped her gather her teaching materials, primers and simple readers she'd brought from her old school. "You don't have to do this," he said, "teaching the ranch hands children." "I want to," she replied, straightening her skirts. Besides, Mrs. Burke was right. They shouldn't have to ride 10 miles to town for basic schooling. She paused at the door, looking back at the Bible still open on the table. "We all bring what we can to a marriage, don't we? You brought me this home, this chance. I bring what I know, teaching, caring, trying to make things a little better." Mason's expression softened with understanding. Catherine used to say something similar, about how love isn't just feeling, it's doing. "She was a wise woman, your Catherine." Sarah said it naturally, without jealousy or reservation. "I hope sometimes she knows her garden will bloom again, that everything she planted here, love, family, hope, it's all still growing." Mason touched the Bible gently, their 2 family histories now forever entwined on its pages. "I think she knows," he said softly. "I think she's known all along." The sound of galloping hooves shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Sarah rolled over in bed to find Mason already pulling on his boots, his movements quick but controlled. Tom's voice carried through the window, tight with urgency. "Mr. Thorne, the north fence is down. Lightning strike from that storm last night. Cattle are already pushing through." Mason grabbed his hat. "How many head we looking at?" "At least 30 breaking for the Miller property. Burke and Henderson are trying to hold them, but with that fence down..." Sarah was already reaching for her dress. "I'll pack food for the men," she said. Years of crisis management as a teacher surfacing in her calm efficiency. Mason paused at the door. "This could be a long day. You don't have to..." "I know," she said, buttoning her dress with swift precision. "I want to. Now go, before we lose more cattle." The kitchen became her command center as she heard horses thundering away. She worked by lamplight, packing biscuits and jerky, filling canteens with fresh water. Through the window, she could see more riders heading north, neighboring ranches answering the emergency call, the way people did out here, where survival meant cooperation. The broken fence represented more than just loose cattle. It was their first real crisis as a married couple, their first test as true partners. Sarah thought of Catherine's recipe box as she worked, wondering if she'd faced similar dawns, similar challenges. By the time she'd loaded the supplies into the wagon, the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of promise. She clicked the reins, and the horses moved forward, knowing the way to the north pasture as well as she did, after weeks of bringing lunch to the men. The scene that greeted her was organized chaos. Riders moved in practiced patterns, trying to contain the scattered cattle. The fence lay splintered, a massive oak branch across its remains, testament to nature's fury. Mason sat atop his horse at the center, calling out directions with the quiet authority she'd come to admire. "Sarah," he called when he spotted her, genuine relief in his voice. "We could use those supplies, and..." He hesitated, then added, "could use your organizational skills too, if you're willing. Too many men, not enough coordination." She nodded, already assessing the situation. "The Miller boys riding in from the east," she reported, noting a dust cloud on the horizon. "And I saw the Jenkins men heading this way as I drove up. How do you want them deployed?" Mason's eyes held a mix of surprise and appreciation. "You've been studying the ranch operations." "I'm a quick study," she said, allowing herself a small smile. "And I used to organize school pageants with 60 children and twice as many opinions. This isn't so different." For the next several hours, Sarah became the nerve center of the operation. She stationed herself by the broken fence with her wagon as a landmark, directing arriving helpers, distributing water and food, and relaying messages between groups of riders. Her teacher's voice carried across the prairie with surprising authority. Mason worked alongside the other men, his shirt darkening with sweat as they wrestled new posts into position. The fence had to be repaired even as they worked to recover the scattered cattle, a complex dance of immediate need and long-term security. "You're good at this," he said during a brief water break, his voice holding newfound respect. "Keeping everything moving, everyone organized." Sarah handed him a fresh canteen. "Different skills, same purpose. We're building something here, aren't we? Not just a fence." He understood her meaning. They worked in seamless tandem now, his experience with the land matching her gift for organization, his physical strength complementing her strategic mind. When Tom rode up with news of the last cattle being herded back, their shared smile felt like a private victory. The sun was setting by the time the fence stood complete. Neighbors began riding for home, their departures accompanied by knowing looks at how naturally Mason and Sarah worked together. The crisis had revealed something to the community. This marriage, rushed and unexpected as it was, had formed a genuine partnership. "Thank you," Mason said, as they loaded empty canteens into the wagon, "for being here, for understanding what needed doing." Sarah looked at the repaired fence, solid and true against the darkening sky. "This is my home now," she said simply. "My life, my responsibility." She paused, then added softly, "Our future." Mason's hand found hers, work-roughened fingers intertwining, with quiet certainty. The broken fence had forced them to face their first challenge together, and in meeting it, they'd built something stronger than wood and wire: trust, understanding, and the deep satisfaction of shared purpose. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between seed catalogues and a newspaper from back east. Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately, the careful penmanship of James Cooper, the man who'd left her standing in her wedding dress at Prairie Junction. Mason was out checking the herd when she found it, and for a long moment she simply stood in the kitchen, letting the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over her. "Mail's here, Mrs. Thorne," Tom called through the screen door already. Heading back to his duties, he'd taken to delivering anything personal directly to the house, a gesture of respect that still warmed her heart. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The paper was expensive, the kind used for business correspondence, and she could smell a hint of tobacco, James's preferred blend. "My dear Miss Mitchell," the letter began, as if her marriage to Mason had never happened, "I write to express my deepest regrets regarding the unfortunate events at Prairie Junction. Mother has since reconsidered her position, and I find myself hoping that you might not have journeyed too far to consider returning." The screen door's creak announced Mason's return, just as Sarah reached the letter's middle section. She turned to find him watching her, his expression shifting from welcome to concern as he read her face. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She held out the letter wordlessly, surprised to find her hand steady now. Mason took it, his eyes scanning the carefully crafted sentences that spoke of reconciliation, of positions in James's growing town, of the library they'd once planned together. "He wants you to come back," Mason said finally, his voice carefully neutral. The kind of neutral she'd learned meant he was holding back stronger emotions. "He wants Miss Mitchell to come back," Sarah corrected, taking the letter and placing it deliberately on the kitchen table. "But she doesn't exist anymore. She disappeared somewhere between Prairie Junction and here." Mason's shoulders remained tense. "You had plans with him. Dreams. A whole life mapped out in those letters you exchanged." "Paper dreams," Sarah said, softly, "like paper flowers, pretty to look at but no real roots." She moved to the window, looking out at the garden she'd begun to reclaim. Real flowers struggled there, fighting for life against the prairie wind, but their beauty was honest, earned. "The library," Mason said, and she heard the slight catch in his voice. "You could have that with him. Books, learning, everything you trained for." Sarah turned back to face him, really looking at this man who'd offered marriage to a stranger and then worked every day to turn that impulsive decision into something real. "Do you know what I've learned here, Mason? That life isn't about what you have, it's about who you become while building it." She crossed to Catherine's recipe box, now sharing space with her own teaching materials and garden journals. "I'm building something here, with you. The school for the ranch children, the garden, our home. It's not the life I imagined, but it's real. It has roots. But if you regret, the only thing I regret," she interrupted, surprising them both, with her vehemence, "is that it took me so long to understand the difference between dreams and reality. James Cooper offered me a position, a role to play. You offered me a partnership." Mason moved closer, close enough that she could see the mix of hope and uncertainty in his eyes. "Sarah, I never want you to feel trapped here. If there's something more you need," she reached for his hand, work roughened and real. "What I need is right here, a man who sees me as I am, not as an idea of what a wife should be, a home that challenges me to grow stronger every day, a life that's sometimes messy and hard, but always honest." Her fingers found the letter on the table, and with deliberate care she tore it in half. The sound seemed to break something in Mason, some last restraint. He pulled her close, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of fear and relief mingled together. "I thought," he whispered into her hair, "when I saw his handwriting, No," she said, understanding all he wasn't saying. "But some doors once closed should stay that way, especially when you found a better window." Through their kitchen window, the prairie stretched endless and promising. their shared future written in every blade of grass, every head of cattle, every flower fighting its way toward the sun. Sarah felt Mason's heartbeat steady against her. Chica knew, with bone-deep certainty, that no paper dreams could compare to this reality they were building together. The first signs of the approaching storm came at dusk, an unnatural stillness in the air, a strange green tinge to the clouds building in the west. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sky with growing concern as Mason emerged from his study, carrying a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. "Father's weather diary," he explained, settling beside her on the porch swing. 30 years of storms and seasons, all recorded right here. He could read the prairie like most men read newspapers. Sarah leaned closer, examining the careful handwriting that documented decades of weather patterns. September 1899, she read. Clouds show anvil formation to northwest. Cattle restless, air pressure dropping. She looked up at Mason. "Just like today." He nodded, turning pages with practiced care. "That storm nearly took the barn. Father wrote down everything he learned from it. Where to move the cattle, how to secure the buildings, which signs to watch for." Thunder rolled in the distance, and the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of rain. Tom appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, his young face serious. "Mr. Thorne, Burke says this looks like a big one coming." Mason consulted the journal again. "Father's notes say with this wind direction, the creek bottom will flood first. We need to move the herd to higher ground." He turned to Sarah. "This could get rough." She was already heading inside. "I'll prepare the storm cellar and help Mrs. Burke gather the children from the outlying houses." "Sarah," Mason's voice stopped. "Be careful. These storms can turn mean fast." She touched his arm briefly. "Your father's journal will guide you with the cattle. Catherine's emergency supplies are still in the cellar. She knew what she was doing. Between their wisdom and our determination, we'll weather this." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Sarah worked with the efficiency she'd learned as a teacher, organizing families, distributing supplies, keeping the children calm with stories and quiet games in the storm cellar. Above, she could hear the wind rising to a howl, punctuated by crashes of thunder that made the younger children jump. Through the cellar's heavy doors, she caught glimpses of the men working, dark shapes moving against the threatening sky, following Mason's directions as they urged the cattle to safer ground. The journal's warnings had been clear. Lose the herd, lose the ranch. "Miss Sarah," little Emma Burke tugged at her skirt, "is Mr. Mason gonna be okay out there?" Sarah gathered the child close, remembering other storms she'd weathered with frightened students. "Mr. Mason knows this land better than anyone, sweetheart, and he has his father's wisdom to guide him." A particularly violent gust rattled the cellar doors. Mrs. Burke, helping to distribute blankets, paused to listen. Never heard the wind quite like this. Sarah thought of the journal's descriptions, the legacy of knowledge passed down through generations of ranch life. Mason's father wrote about a storm like this back in 1999. They survived that one, and we'll survive this. The hours crept by, marked by prayers and whispered conversations, by children finally drifting to sleep on makeshift pallets. Sarah kept watch at the doors, straining to see through the rain and darkness, waiting for any sign of the men's return. Finally, near midnight, the storm began to lose its fury. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan, and the lightning moved east, leaving them with the steady drum of rain. When the cellar doors opened, Mason stood there, drenched but whole, his father's journal tucked safely inside his coat. "The herd's safe," he reported as relieved families began to emerge. "We got them to the high ground just like Father's notes said. Lost some fencing, but nothing we can't rebuild." Sarah helped Mrs. Burke gather her sleeping children, then turned to find Mason watching her with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "You handled everything here perfectly," he said softly. "We all did what needed doing," she replied, remembering. The quiet strength of the women and children waiting out the storm, everyone playing their part. Your father's journal, Catherine's preparations, our people working together, it all matters. Later, as they sat at their kitchen table with cups of hot coffee, Mason opened the weather journal again. Sarah watched as he carefully recorded the night's events in his own hand, adding to his father's legacy of knowledge. "It's more than just weather notes, isn't it?" she observed. "It's a story of survival, of learning to read the land and sky, of passing down what matters." Mason nodded, his pen moving steadily across the page. "Father used to say every storm teaches you something, if you're willing to learn. Tonight taught me that I'm a fortunate man, having a wife who knows how to be strong when strength is needed." Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his, where it rested on the journal's weathered pages. Outside, the rain continued to fall, gentle now, bringing life to the parched earth. Together, they had faced their first real test as keepers of this land, this legacy, this life they were building. The storm had revealed not just their resilience, but the deep roots they'd begun to grow. Roots that, like the ancient prairie grass, could bend with the wind without breaking. The autumn fair transformed Prairie Junction from a dusty way station into a buzzing hub of activity. Bunting decorated the storefronts, and the smell of barbecue and fresh-baked pies filled the air. Sarah stood before their wagon display of preserved goods, straightening the jar of wild plum preserves she'd made using Catherine's recipe, amended with her own additions. "Those look fine, just as they are," Mason said softly, coming up behind her. He'd traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and his good hat, and Sarah felt a flutter of pride seeing him so handsome, so at ease. "I just want everything to be perfect," she admitted. "It's our first fair together, and everyone will be—" She trailed off, but Mason understood. "Watching?" he finished. "Let them watch. Let them see what we've built together." The morning sun caught the glass jars, making them glow like stained glass windows. Plum preserves deep purple, pickled beans in neat rows, golden peach butter that had taken all summer to perfect. Each jar represented hours spent in their kitchen, Mason reading from Catherine's recipes while Sarah experimented, both of them laughing over failed attempts and celebrating successes. "Mrs. Thorne!" Emma Burke came running up, her braids flying. "Mama says the judging's about to start." Sarah smoothed her best dress, dark blue cotton that Mason said brought out her eyes, and tried to quiet her nervousness. This wasn't just about preserves. This was about belonging, about proving she was more than just the woman who'd arrived in a wedding dress meant for another man. The judges moved slowly down the row of displays, making notes and exchanging whispered comments. Sarah recognized Mrs. Henderson from the station, now serving as head judge, and tried to read her expression as she lifted the plum preserves to the light. "Interesting color," she heard Mrs. Henderson say. "Deeper than usual. And look at the clarity. That'll be the wild plums." Mason spoke up, his quiet pride evident. "Sarah found them growing along the creek bed where Catherine's old trees used to be, said they had more character than the cultivated kind." Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened at the mention of Catherine. "She always did say those wild plums were worth the extra trouble." She turned to Sarah. "You've done her recipe proud, Mrs. Thorne, and added your own touch, I think." Sarah nodded. "A bit of orange peel and vanilla bean. Catherine's notes mentioned experimenting with different flavors, so I thought—" She stopped, suddenly aware of the small crowd gathering around their display. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, pinning a blue ribbon to their display board, "I'd say both you and Catherine were right. Best preserves I've tasted in 10 years of judging." The ribbon's blue silk caught the sunlight as bright as hope. Sarah felt Mason's hand find hers, squeezing gently. Around them, neighbors and townspeople offered congratulations, but it was the way they said "the Thorns" that meant the most, as if the name belonged to both of them now, had always belonged to both of them. Later, as the afternoon turned, Golden and fiddle music filled the air. Mason led Sarah toward the makeshift dance floor. "I'm not much for dancing," he warned. "Catherine used to say I had 2 left feet." Sarah smiled, remembering her school pageants. "Then we'll stumble together. Sometimes that's the best way to learn new steps." They moved slowly among the other couples, finding their rhythm. Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces. Tom dancing with the miller's daughter, the Burkes watching their children play tag between the dancers, Mrs. Henderson serving up slices of prize-winning apple pie, a community that had become hers. One preserved jar and shared story at a time. "Look," Mason murmured, nodding toward their display. Little Emma Burke stood admiring the blue ribbon, her finger tracing its edges with careful reverence. Next generation of preserve makers in the making. "Maybe we could teach her," Sarah suggested. "Start a preserve-making class along with the regular lessons. Pass on what we know, just like Catherine's recipes were passed to us." Mason's arms tightened around her slightly. "Building something that lasts," he said softly. "Something bigger than just us." The blue ribbon caught the last rays of sunlight, transformed into a beacon of belonging. Sarah rested her head against Mason's shoulder, feeling the rightness of this moment, this life they'd chosen. They'd taken 2 separate stories and preserved them together, creating something new and sweet and lasting, like wild plums transformed by patience and care into something precious. The letter arrived wrapped in Emily's familiar, flourished handwriting, but it was the second envelope inside, addressed in their father's shaky script, that made Sarah sink into her kitchen chair. The last letter she'd received from him had been 4 years ago, when he'd retired from the pulpit. "Bad news?" Mason asked from the doorway, his arms full of firewood for the approaching winter. Sarah shook her head slowly. "I'm not sure yet." She broke the seal on her father's letter, aware of Mason quietly setting down the wood and moving to put the kettle on. He'd learned, these past months, when to offer presents without pressure. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "your sister tells me you have married. A rancher, she says, though she knows little else. I find myself thinking of your mother's last words to me, that our greatest test of faith is learning to trust in joy. We didn't plan for—" The kettle's whistle made her jump. Mason poured 2 cups of tea, setting one beside her with the same care he showed handling newborn calves or Catherine's recipe box. "Papa's had a stroke," she said finally, looking up. "From the pages. He's recovered mostly, but Emily thinks I should come home to help care for him." The words felt strange in her mouth. Home having become this kitchen, this man, this life they'd built together. Mason settled into the chair across from her, his face carefully neutral. "When would she want you to go?" "That's just it." Sarah spread the letters on the table between them. "Emily's letter talks about coming home for good. She mentions a teaching position opening up at my old school, talks about how Papa needs his family around him." She met Mason's eyes. "She writes as if my marriage to you was just another false start, like the arrangement with James." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crack and pop of the newly laid fire. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, delicate flakes dancing past the window. "Would you want to go?" Mason's voice was gentle, but Sarah heard the echoes of old wounds, Catherine's death, the years of loneliness, the fragile trust they'd built together. "Want to?" "No." She reached across the table, taking his work-roughened hand in hers. "But Papa raised us on sermons about duty and family obligation. Emily's carrying it all alone right now, and I—" She squeezed his hand. "I need to know what you think, what you feel." Mason was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I think," he said finally, "that I understand duty to family better than most. And I think that any man who raised a daughter like you deserves care in his time of need." He met her eyes steadily. "But I also think there might be another way." Sarah felt something ease in her chest, the beginning of hope. "What do you mean?" "The East. Room upstairs," he said. "The one we've been talking about turning into a proper library. It gets good light. And with some help from Tom and the others, we could add a bathroom like we did for Mrs. Burke's mother." he paused. If your father was willing, and if you wanted, you'd open our home to him? Sarah whispered. Even though he's a stranger, Mason's smile held a touch of his dry humor. Seems to me I have a history of opening my home to strangers who become family. Sarah stood, moving around the table to wrap her arms around his shoulders from behind. She pressed her face into his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and honest work. I love you, she said, the words coming naturally now. Do you know that? Not just for this offer, but for understanding who I am. All of me, including where I come from. He turned in his chair to face her. Write to Emily, he said softly. Tell her our door is open if father wants to come west. Tell her she's welcome too, her and the children, whenever they can visit. We'll make room. His eyes crinkled at the corners. That's what family does, isn't it? Makes room for what matters. Sarah looked around their kitchen, at Catherine's recipe box sharing space with her mother's old Bible, at the blue ribbon, from the fair hanging beside Mason's father's weather journal, at the way the firelight made shadows dance across walls that had seen generations of love and loss and new beginnings. Yes, she said, that's exactly what family does. She picked up her father's letter, seeing it now not as a threat to her happiness, but as an opportunity to bridge two worlds. I'll write to them tonight. Show them that home isn't always where you started. Sometimes it's where you find the courage to begin again. Dawn painted the wheat fields gold as Sarah stood at the edge of their property, watching the first harvest wagon roll toward the waiting fields. Mason had been up since before first light, checking equipment and organizing the crew. Now he rode, up beside her, his horse's breath making clouds in the cool morning air. First harvest together, he said softly, reaching down to touch her shoulder. Catherine always said harvest shows you what you've really been growing all year long. Sarah covered his hand with hers. More than just wheat and cattle, I'd say. The harvest crew assembled. Ranch hands and neighboring farmers who still believed in the old ways of communities working together. Tom sat proudly atop the new mechanical harvester, a purchase Mason and Sarah had decided on together after long evenings studying costs and capabilities. Mrs. Thorne, Mrs. Burke called from the chuck wagon, we're ready when you are. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this day, combining Catherine's harvest recipes with her own innovations. The men would need steady meals to keep them going through the long days ahead. She'd learned that feeding a harvest crew was as much about nurturing spirit as body. Remember when you first came? Mason asked as she turned to go. Tom thought. You might be too citified for ranch life. Sarah laughed, remembering her early awkwardness. He wasn't entirely wrong. But growing into something new, that's what harvest is all about, isn't it? The day unfolded like a well-rehearsed dance. The mechanical harvester moved through the wheat fields, guided by Tom's careful hands. Teams of men followed, gathering and binding, their movements practiced and efficient. Sarah and Mrs. Burke kept the chuck wagon moving, bringing food and water where needed. Mason rode between groups, overseeing operations with quiet confidence. But Sarah noticed how often his eyes found her, as if making sure she was real, that this shared harvest wasn't just something he'd dreamed during his lonely years. By midday, the first fields were done. The men gathered in the shade of the chuck wagon, drinking coffee and sharing the hand pies Sarah had baked in the pre-dawn. Hours. She heard snippets of their conversation about how the ranch had changed, how it felt more alive somehow. Different kind of harvest this year, old Burke said, his voice carrying across the group. Feels more like the old days, when Catherine... He stopped, looking uncertainly at Sarah. Go on, she encouraged. I'd like to hear about those days. The old rancher's face softened. She'd make these molasses cookies, had her own special recipe. Said a harvest crew ran on sugar and stories as much as anything. Sarah reached into the wagon and brought out a tin. You mean these cookies? Found the recipe in her box. Took me 3 tries to get them right. The men's faces as they bit into. The familiar cookies told her more than words could. about memory and continuity, about how love could be passed down through something as simple as a well-worn recipe card. Later, as the sun began its westward slide, Mason found her by the last, unharvested field. "You've done more than just help with the harvest," he said. "You've helped bring the heart back to this place." Sarah watched the wheat ripple in the evening breeze. "We did it together. Everything growing here, the wheat, the garden, the new fruit trees we planted, it's all part of the same harvest, the one we're growing as a family." The mechanical harvester made its final pass, Tom grinning with pride as he guided it through. The last rose. The setting sun turned wheat dust to gold mist, creating halos around the workers as they began gathering their tools. "Catherine would have loved this," Mason said quietly, "seeing the ranch so alive again, seeing how you've taken what she started and helped it grow into something new." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had become her. "Home? I think she does see it, in the flowers blooming in her garden, in the recipes we've made our own, in the way this land keeps giving when you love it right." They stood together as the harvest moon rose, watching their crew head in for the evening meal. The air was rich with the smell of cut wheat and cooling earth, of meals shared and work well done. Their first harvest together had yielded more than full granaries and fat cattle. It had produced the sweet fruit of belonging, of two lives woven together as naturally as wheat stalks plaited into a harvest crown. "Come on," Mason said finally, taking her hand. "Let's go home. Tomorrow's another day of bringing in what we've grown." Sarah walked beside him, knowing he meant more than just the remaining wheat. They were harvesting the seeds they'd planted. Months ago on that train platform, seeds of trust, of second chances, of love that grew stronger for being chosen rather than planned. The winter of 1913 hit the prairie with unprecedented fury. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and temperatures dropped so low that breath froze in beards and eyelashes. Sarah stood at the window of their bedroom, watching Mason and the men struggle through another morning of breaking ice on the cattle troughs when she remembered the trunk in the attic. Mason's grandmother made it, Catherine had written in her journal, a wedding quilt meant to last generations. On the coldest nights, it carries the warmth of all the loves that came before. Sarah climbed the attic stairs, shivering as her lantern light fell across the old trunk. Inside, carefully wrapped in muslin, lay the quilt, a masterpiece of tiny stitches and intricate patterns, each piece telling part of the Thorne family story. "Sarah," Mason's voice carried up the stairs. "Where are you?" She gathered the quilt. In her arms, feeling its substantial weight. "In the attic. I found something we need." Mason met her at the bottom of the stairs, snow melting from his coat. His eyes widened at the sight of the quilt. "Grandmother's wedding gift. I couldn't. I know," she said softly, understanding how some memories needed time before they could be touched. "But I think she'd want it used now, when we need it most." That evening, as wind howled outside like a living thing, they sat together beneath the quilt in front of the fire. Sarah's fingers traced the patterns while Mason told her the stories behind each one. The star pattern from his grandmother's journey west, the interlocked rings from his parents' courtship, the tiny flowers Catherine had added along one border. "There's room here," Sarah observed, touching an empty corner, "for our own piece of the story." Mason's arm tightened around her. "What would you add? Perhaps a fence post," she smiled, "or a jar of wild plum preserves, or maybe—" She hesitated, then placed his hand over her middle, where the smallest of swellings had just begun to show. His intake of breath was sharp, his hand trembling, slightly against her. "Sarah, are you certain? As certain as spring follows winter," she said softly. "Though we'll need Dr. Wilson to confirm it properly when the road's clear." The news seemed to warm the room more than any fire could. Mason pulled her closer, his face a mix of joy and wonder that reminded her of their wedding day. Under the E.I. quilt, their hands remained linked over the promise of new life. The following days tested their strength as the winter deepened. Supplies ran low in the bunkhouse, forcing them to reorganize and share what they had. Sarah turned Catherine's recipes into lessons in stretching provisions, teaching Mrs. Burke and the other ranch wives how to make hearty soups from seemingly nothing. At night, beneath their grandmother's quilt, Sarah and Mason planned for the future. They talked of converting the small room next to theirs into a nursery, of how their child would grow up knowing both Catherine's garden and Sarah's books, of the legacy of love and resilience they would pass on. The worst night came, when two pregnant heifers went into labor during a blizzard. The temperature had dropped so low that the men's lanterns kept freezing shut. Sarah organized a relay of hot water and blankets from the house to the barn, wearing Catherine's old coat, which still smelled faintly of garden herbs. "You shouldn't be out in this," Mason protested when he found her making another trip through the snow. "Neither should you," she countered, "but here we are. Life doesn't wait for fair weather." Together they worked through the night, saving both calves and their mothers. When dawn finally broke, pale and precious through the storm clouds, they made their way back to the house, exhausted but triumphant. Mrs. Burke had kept the fire going and the coffee hot. "Like watching a miracle," she said as they shed their frozen outer layers. "You two working together like that, almost as if we'd always been meant to find each other." Sarah finished, sharing a smile with Mason. "Sometimes the hardest winters bring the sweetest springs." That night, wrapped in the quilt that had witnessed generations of love, Sarah felt the first flutter of movement beneath her heart. Mason's hand found the spot immediately, as if their child had called to him. "Your grandmother's quilt," Sarah murmured sleepily. "It really does hold the warmth of all the loves that came before." "And the ones yet to come," Mason added softly, his voice full of promise. Outside, the winter winds continued their fierce dance across the prairie, but inside, beneath the quilt's protective embrace, their small family grew stronger with each passing day. They had found in each other not just warmth, but the kind of love that could weather any storm, one stitch, one day, one shared challenge at a time. Spring arrived like a gentle awakening, melting winter's harsh memories into streams of promise. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her growing belly pressed against its edge, carefully sorting through the newly arrived seed catalogues. Beside her lay Catherine's garden journal, open to pages filled with notes about planting times and soil preferences. "The seed order came in," Mason announced, stepping through the door with a wooden crate. His eyes softened at the sight of her, the way they always did now. "Mr. Henderson said these were the varieties you specified." Sarah reached eagerly for the packets, each one a promise of something new. "Look," she said, holding up one with particular reverence. "These are from Catherine's favorite supplier. Her notes say their climbing roses are especially hardy." "Roses?" Mason settled into the chair beside her, his hand naturally finding its way to rest on her belly. "I thought we were focusing on practical things, vegetables for canning, herbs for medicine." "Life needs beauty as much as practicality," Sarah replied, covering his hand with hers. "Besides, these aren't just any roses. They're the same variety Catherine planted the year you were married. Her journal says they survived that terrible drought in Zello too." Their child chose that moment to kick, making them both smile. At 6 months along, the baby was active, especially when Sarah worked in the garden. "Already a farmer," Mason would joke, though his voice always held a note of wonder. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, spreading the seed packets out like playing cards. "What if we expanded the garden, not just for us, but for teaching?" She pulled out a rough sketch she'd made. "We could add a section here for the children to learn about growing things. Mrs. Burke says her Emma can't stop talking about the preserves we made last fall." Mason studied the drawing, his expression thoughtful. Teaching gardens. Catherine would have loved that idea. He paused, tracing the planned layout with his finger. "You're building something here that goes beyond just plants, aren't you?" "I'm building on what she started," Sarah corrected gently. "What you both started. A place where things grow. Plants, yes, but also knowledge, community, family." She sorted through the packets until she found the herbs. "Look at these healing plants that Catherine wrote about. We could teach the women of the ranch about them, pass on her knowledge. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the gilt edges of Catherine's journal and making the seed packets glow like stained glass. Outside, the prairie was beginning to green, early wildflowers dotting the warming earth with splashes of color. "Tom's been clearing that patch behind the garden," Mason said. "Says it gets good morning light. Would that work for your teaching space?" Sarah's heart swelled with love for this man who consistently made room for her dreams. "It would be perfect. We could set up some benches, maybe a small shelter for shade." She stopped laughing. "Listen to me, planning like I'll be able to do heavy garden work any time soon. That's what community's for," Mason reminded her. "Mrs. Burke was just saying yesterday how the women want to help prepare for the baby. Why not put them to work in the garden too?" As if summoned by their discussion, a knock at the door revealed Emma Burke, her face bright with anticipation. "Mama said to ask if you needed help with the spring planting, Mrs. Thorne." Sarah exchanged a smile with Mason. "Actually, Emma, we were just talking about starting a special garden for teaching. Would you like to be our first student?" The girl's eyes lit up as Sarah showed her the seed packets, explaining how each one needed different care, different conditions to thrive. Mason watched them, his expression soft, before quietly excusing himself to check on the morning's ranch work. Later, as Sarah and Emma planted the first seeds in small containers to start indoors, Sarah felt the perfect rightness of the moment. Here was Catherine's legacy growing in new directions, like the climbing roses that would soon grace the garden walls. Here was the future they were building, not just in the child she carried, but in the knowledge being passed down, the connections being forged. "Mrs. Thorne," Emma asked, carefully patting soil around a tomato seed, "do you think when the baby comes it'll love growing things too?" Sarah looked out at the prairie spring, at the land that had given her so much more than she'd ever dreamed. "That day at the train station, I think," she said softly, "that love of any kind, properly tended, can't help but grow." The morning of their first anniversary dawned clear and bright, much like the day they'd met at Prairie Junction. Sarah woke to find Mason's side of the bed empty, but a small package wrapped in brown paper lay on his pillow. Beneath it was a note in his careful handwriting, "Meet me where our story began." Her heart quickened as she unwrapped the package. Inside lay a gold wedding band, simple but elegant, clearly chosen with thought and care. Until now, she'd worn only the simple brass ring they'd hastily purchased the day of their wedding. Moving carefully with her 8 months pregnant form, Sarah dressed in the blue dress she'd worn at last year's fair. Through the window, she could see Tom already hitching the wagon, a knowing smile on his young face. The drive to Prairie Junction stirred memories with each familiar landmark. The fence they'd repaired together during that first crisis, the wild plum trees that had yielded such wonderful preserves, the creek where they'd found Catherine's roses growing wild. Each site was a chapter in their story. The station platform looked just as it had that day. Sun-bleached wood, the same creaking boards, even Mrs. Henderson's geraniums blooming in their tin cans. But now Mason stood waiting, dressed in his good suit, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Exactly 1 year ago," he said as Tom helped her down from the wagon, "you sat here with a broken dream and incredible courage." He took her hands in his. "I didn't know then that watching you face disappointment with such grace would change my life forever." Sarah felt tears threatening. "Mason, let me finish," he said softly. "I've been thinking about what to give you for our anniversary. Thought about jewelry or maybe a new piano like you mentioned missing from your teaching days." He pulled something from his pocket, the brass ring she'd worn all year. "But then I realized what I really wanted to give you was a proper choice." He knelt carefully on the platform, mindful of his Sunday clothes. "Sarah Mitchell Thorne, this past year you've turned my house back into a home. You've helped me honor Catherine's memory while building our own joy. You've shown me that love isn't just something that happens to you, it's something you choose. Every day, he held up both rings. So I'm asking, will you choose me again? Not in haste or desperation, but with the knowledge of exactly who we are together. Sarah was fully crying now, remembering another man's rejection on this very platform, remembering how that ending had led to this beautiful beginning. "You wonderful, foolish man," she said through her tears. "I choose you every morning when I wake up and every evening when I fall asleep. I choose you with every seed we plant and every story we share." She held out her hand, letting him slide the brass ring off and replace it with the gold one. But when he went to pocket the old ring, she stopped him. "No," she said, "let's keep it somewhere special, to remind us that sometimes the most precious things start simply." As if on cue, Mrs. Henderson emerged from the station office with a cake, a proper one this time, with white icing and fresh flowers from Catherine's garden. Other familiar faces appeared, the Burkes, Tom and his sweetheart, even Judge Wilson, who had married them. "Did you plan all this?" Sarah asked, amazed. At the gathering crowd, Mason smiled. "Actually, they planned it. Said our story gave them hope. Reminded them that love can bloom in unexpected places." They shared cake and memories on the platform, where their journey had begun. Sarah noticed how naturally Mason's hand kept finding hers, how their fingers, intertwined like the roses climbing their garden walls back home. "Your father's train arrives next week," Mason reminded her softly. "Think he'll understand our story when he sees it firsthand." Sarah touched the new ring, feeling how right it felt. "He'll understand. Love's funny that way. Sometimes you have to step back to see its perfect logic." The afternoon sun turned the prairie to gold, just as it had a year ago. But now, instead of an ending, Sarah saw beginnings everywhere, in the life growing within. Her in the garden, waiting for her father's arrival, in the way Mason looked at her with eyes full of chosen joy. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Thorne," he whispered, his hand warm in hers. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Thorne," she replied, knowing that this moment, this man, this life was better than any dream she could have planned. 1 year and 3 months after their own fateful meeting, Mason and Sarah sat together on the Prairie Junction platform, waiting for the afternoon train. Their 2-month-old daughter, Catherine Rose, slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, wrapped in the grandmother's quilt that had seen them through the winter. "Train's running late," Mason observed, his hand resting protectively on the small of Sarah's back. "Reminds me of another afternoon at this station." Sarah smiled, remembering when a heartbroken woman in a faded wedding dress learned that sometimes life's cruelest disappointments lead to its greatest blessings. The station looked different now, or perhaps they saw it differently. Mrs. Henderson's geraniums had been joined by cuttings from Catherine's roses, which Sarah had shared in the spring. The hard wooden bench where she'd once sat in despair now held a cushion embroidered by the ranch wives. A commotion from the station office drew their attention. A young woman emerged, clutching a carpet bag, her face bearing the unmistakable look of shattered hopes. Sarah recognized that expression, had worn it herself not so long ago. "Third one this month," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, approaching with a cup of water for the girl. "Mail order arrangement gone wrong. Family took one look at her grey hair and said she was too old at 40. Mason and Sarah exchanged a glance heavy with understanding. Their daughter stirred, her tiny hand reaching up to grasp Sarah's finger. Looking at the stranger's devastation, Sarah felt the weight of all the moments that had led her here, to this man, this child, this life, rich with chosen love. "Would you hold Catherine Rose for a moment?" she asked Mason, already knowing his answer. He took their daughter with practiced tenderness, the sight still making Sarah's heart swell. She approached the woman slowly, recognizing the way she held herself rigid against breaking. "I'm Sarah Thorne," she said softly, "and I know exactly what you're feeling right now." The woman looked up, surprise breaking through her misery. "You do?" Sarah settled beside her on the bench, the same bench where Mason had first offered her his handkerchief. "A year ago, I sat right here in a wedding dress, having just received a telegram very much like yours." She paused, letting that sink in. "Would you like to hear what happened next?" As Sarah spoke, Mason walked their daughter nearby, his presence steady and reassuring. She told the woman, Rachel Miller was her name, about choices and chances, about how love sometimes comes disguised as devastation, about a man who saw her strength instead of her age, who offered partnership instead of mere position. But that sort of lightning couldn't strike twice, Rachel protested weakly, though hope had begun to kindle in her eyes. "Perhaps not exactly the same way," Sarah agreed, "but I know for a fact that the Jenkins Ranch is looking for a housekeeper. Mr. Jenkins lost his wife last spring, and those 4 children of his need a mother's touch." She smiled gently. "He mentioned just yesterday that he wanted someone with life experience, someone who would understand growing children's hearts as well as keeping their clothes mended." "I was a seamstress," Rachel said softly, before I thought I needed to change everything about my life." "Sometimes," Mason said, rejoining them with their sleeping daughter, "the life you need is waiting just around the corner from the life you thought you wanted." The afternoon train whistle sounded in the distance, the train that would have taken Rachel back east, back to a life grown too small for her spirit. Instead, Sarah watched her square her shoulders with new purpose. "The Jenkins place, you said?" Later, after they'd seen Rachel settled with a proper introduction to the Jenkins family, Mason and Sarah stood again on the platform, waiting for the evening train that would bring her father to his new home with them. "You know," Mason said, thoughtfully, "watching you with Rachel today, it made me realize something. We're not just building a life anymore, we're building a legacy." Sarah looked down at their daughter, seeing in her peaceful face all the possibilities of love and courage yet to come. "Catherine's garden grows more than just roses now," she said softly. "It grows hope, second chances, new beginnings." The evening train approached, its whistle calling across the prairie like a voice from the past, reaching toward the future. Sarah felt Mason's arm around her waist, solid and sure. Their daughter sighed in her sleep, and the setting sun turned the station's weathered boards to gold, just as it had that first day, when 2 broken hearts had found the courage to believe in love one last time. "Welcome home," Sarah whispered, though whether to her approaching father, to Rachel finding her new path, or to her own complete and chosen happiness, she wasn't quite sure. Perhaps to all of them, to every heart that had or would find its way, to healing on this sun-warm platform where endings became beginnings, and love proved stronger than any careful plan.